Right, well, I think we might get started soon. It's 12:03. So firstly, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. I'm just checking that you can all hear me.
We can all hear you.
We can hear
Thank you. So my name is Freya Higgins. I lead the Building Access project for People with Disability Australia. And that's a project that's been working towards making the New South Wales domestic and family violence sector more inclusive and accessible. And we're putting these webinars on at the request of some of the services that we've been working with. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about women with disability abuse and human rights today. But before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge that, well, the traditional owners of the lands that we're all living and working on here in Australia. I am working on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, sea, and culture, and also say that I think we have a lot to learn about living in harmony with the land from Aboriginal people and culture. And I'd also like to pay my respects to any First Nations people here today and watching this in the future. So yeah, I'm really excited to be bringing Frances Corn-Ferrand on to teach us a bit about human rights. We speak a lot about women with disability and our high rates of experiencing violence and abuse, and the complexity of the abuse that we experience, and the many drivers of violence, and the many barriers that we face to getting support and seeking justice and escaping abusive situations. And I felt, having done this work for some years, that it's also really important that we talk about how we address the barriers that women with disability are facing, whether we are women with disability ourselves or supporters and advocates for women with disability, and in particular, women with disability who experience abuse. I know that when I worked as an advocate, I often raised issues with ministers when we couldn't get an outcome any other way. And often what would get a response was actually pointing out to ministers and their officers that they were not upholding the rights of people with disability, and that they had human rights obligations, and that, at this point they were failing to meet them, and that they needed to address this. And that often got attention and sometimes good responses from ministers and government departments. So I think whether we're talking about justice, housing, education, employment, and all the areas in which we do encounter barriers for ourselves or the people we support, I think it's really important that we understand human rights, and that we keep raising human rights and keep reminding the powers that be that they have a duty to uphold the human rights that Australia is committed to. So that's why I'm really thrilled to have Frances, who is PWDA's resident human rights expert, come on and give us a workshop about what human rights are and how we use them to create a more just and inclusive society. So I'll just briefly introduce Frances, and then Frances, I'll hand it over to you. So Frances is our Senior Research and Policy Officer here at People with Disability Australia. She has worked in the community and the disability sector for the past 18 years. She's also a social scientist and a graduate social worker. And she is currently undertaking a PhD in community research, policy translation, and the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability in Australia. She is living and working up in the Pine Rivers region, north of Brisbane, with her 2 rescue dogs. So Frances, thank you again so much for being here today and for sharing your knowledge with us. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Frances.
Thank you, Freya. That was very generous of you. Just acknowledging that I'm coming from Cubby country here in southeast Queensland, which is part of the Pine Rivers region and a beautiful part of the world it is too. I'll give you a brief description of what I'm wearing. I'm wearing a cobalt blue top. I have blondish hair, sort of short. I'm wearing headphones with a microphone attached. I have dark glasses with clear lenses. I'm wearing red lipstick. In the background, I have a piano with a clock on top and some items. This is a home office, so there are home things in the background. Thank you. I always feel a bit uncomfortable when I'm named an expert in human rights. I think I'm not really an expert. I'm learning, and I think that's a really important position because we're all learning. Human rights are certainly inalienable, but they're also developing. And today I'm going to talk to you about 2 conventions that cover human rights. One is the Crpd, which is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and Cedaw, which is the Convention to End All Forms of Violence Against Women. And they're 2 very important pieces of international human rights law, both of which Australia has is signatory to, and that's important because, as Freya noted, when we advocate for women with disability, people with disability, we can use these pieces of international human rights law to remind people in authority, whether they are government agencies or service providers, that they have to respect the rights, the human rights of people with disability and the human rights of women with disability. Okay, we'll just flick to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, this is a great photo. I'll explain it. I took this at night on the last session in Geneva in front of the Palais des Nations, the Palace of Nations. These are all the flags of all of the countries who are involved with the United Nations. And this is in Geneva in Switzerland. And I was there supporting the Australian civil society delegation as they reported to the committee on the Convention of the Rights of People with Disability about Australia's performance. And it was a very interesting experience, and I can also attest that Australia did not perform particularly well, which is a bit disappointing. Okay, we'll flick across to the next slide and I'll explain what we're going to do today. So as I said, we're going to cover 2 conventions, Cedaw and the Crpd, and how we can use them in advocacy. This will probably take maybe 20-25 minutes or so, and then we can have some discussion. You can ask me pretty much anything. I'm probably more over the Crpd than Cedaw, but certainly I use Cedaw in my work, and so does Freya. And I think that should probably bring us up to 1 hour. How does that sound for everybody? So give me a thumbs up, and is that okay?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so on this slide, what we've got is a picture, a cut off picture of the United Nations symbol, which is a graphic of map of the world with the peace sign around it, which is actually olive leaves. So you might know that the olive leaf is a symbol of peace. So not that advocacy is necessarily a peaceful occupation, I might add. Sometimes we have to get stroppy and it's necessary. It's like all relationships, we have to sometimes point out that things aren't quite right and they need to be corrected. And as I noted earlier with Freya, we do use key legislation to support our clients and to make a case. And that includes things like the Disability Discrimination Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, and various other pieces of legislation. But those would be the two primary ones around domestic legislation that we use. And as I mentioned, there are two important human rights laws that we can also use. And that's the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Australia ratified in 2008, and the Convention to End Discrimination against Violence Against Women, Cedaw, which we ratified, hold your breath, in 1979. I was just a girl, like a really little girl, when this particular convention was ratified. And it took 10 years for it to really come on board in Australia. And that happened with the development of what was known as the Equal Opportunities Commission and has since morphed into the Human Rights Commission. Does anybody remember that at all? No? Am I that old? But yes, that's how we got our Human Rights Commission. I
remember that.
Thank you.
I was born. I came here in 2000, and it was still the Human Rights Commission. It hadn't changed its name then.
Oh, well, it used to be the Equal Opportunities Commission, and that became the Human Rights Commission. So yes, 2000, it was still it was the Human Rights Commission. So yes, brilliant. Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so we're going to talk about the CRPD first, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. This is a really interesting piece of human rights law. So as I said, it was ratified in 2008. The very beginning of this particular piece of human rights law actually started in 1999 in Mexico, of all places. Now, Mexico is certainly not a place that we would associate with human rights in a positive way. We would usually see Mexico as violating human rights, especially around women and people with disability. And what happened was some advocates and disability advocates, activists in Mexico broke into a mental health institution in the north of Mexico, revealed the appalling conditions, the gross human rights violations, brought the evidence back to Mexico City and showed it to the president, the then president of Mexico, and said, this is really bad, we've got to do something. The then president of Mexico said, well, if it's bad here, it's got to be bad everywhere. And then proceeded to use Mexico's embassies and high commissions across the globe to lobby other countries, to lobby the UN to develop a convention on the rights of people with disability. They were able to bring that up to the UN in 2001. And by 2004, it was well on the way to development. So it's actually one of the fastest developed human rights tools in the history of the United Nations. And it is currently the only human rights tool developed in the 21st century. There is another one on the way, and that's got to do with the rights of seniors and older people. But currently the CRPD is the only 21st century human rights tool. And it's a really interesting piece of law, as I said, because it not only, whoop, go back a bit, I haven't finished. Back one slide, thank you. It is not only clarifies all the categories of rights that apply to people with disability, just the same rights as everybody else. It also identifies where things need to change or things need to adapt. That's in each country and their domestic law and legislation. And it also points to where rights are being violated. Article 6 specifically pertains to women and girls with disability. So as a holistic convention, it actually speaks directly to women and girls. It also speaks directly to children later on. So it's very unusual as a piece of human rights legislation. If you can go to the next slide now. Thank you. Thank you. Human rights and transformative equality. Now, this is where the CRPD gets really interesting and a little bit radical. Because not only is it the only 21st century human rights tool to be developed, the CRPD has a very, very specific goal. So it's not just about pointing out where human rights should be or could be. It's about actually changing the whole system and structure. That's what transformative equality is about. And this comes from a position of inherent and inalienable human rights, and seeing people with disability as not something separate or something to be segregated or something special. It's about seeing disability as part of the human condition, that we are either born this way or we acquire disability. So in Australia, 1 in 5 people are disabled. And worldwide, there are 1 billion disabled people that we know of. And I would suggest that there are actually quite a lot more. So in terms of, you know, the whole of humanity, we're not an exception. We're simply part of humanity. Go back a bit, Ben. Not yet. I don't know. Thank you very much. So as I said, transformative equality. The CRPD seeks to especially change not only the physical conditions in which we live, but also the social conditions. It seeks to achieve radical social change via inclusion and transformative equality. And I'm sorry if the slideshow keeps moving across. It has a mind of its own. Does anyone just quickly have any questions around transformative equality, or would you like to hold that to the end? I'll take silence as assent, and we can talk about it at the end. I really like it. I think you can tell. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So why is transformative equality important? Because it's about reshaping or even recreating the dominant systems that create inequality. So those systems are things like the legal system, things like the welfare system, which in Australia is particularly punitive. And it's also about transforming attitudes. So we talk about ableism a lot. Inclusion is something that in the disability sector gets a really long workout. I mean, a long workout. And who doesn't know about companies and agencies and NGOs? They always have a diversity and inclusion committee or something or other, forever talking about it. But inclusion is only authentic if the system in which which deliberately excludes us is changed. So keeping us over on the diversity and inclusion table over there is not changing the system. It's keeping us segregated. So otherwise it's tokenistic. It's a tick box effect. It's like, you know, agency XYZ has a diversity and inclusion committee and we'll just pop them over there and we've done it. Well, no, that's not what the CRPD is about. Otherwise, it is merely tokenistic and an ongoing perpetration of discrimination and a denial of our otherwise inalienable human rights. Basically, it's ableism by stealth, and it's done all the time. So, as noted, the CRPD has a specific social agenda, which is change the system. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Cedaw. So we're going to talk about this piece of this really important and really landmark piece of international human rights law that was ratified in 1979. So this is a really specific convention aimed at ending all forms of discrimination to women all over the globe. And it identifies that women have endured multiple varieties of discrimination and violence for decades, eons even. So I beg your pardon, it was proposed in 79, but wasn't elevated into law until 1981. There is a process with human rights law about how it gets created, elevated, signed and ratified. It is a process. The convention requires states parties to take all appropriate measures, including legislation, to ensure the full development and advancement of women for the purpose of guaranteeing them the exercise and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms on a basis of equality with men. I think that's really important. That comes directly from the convention. And I think that's really important to point out, because I don't know what other women have experienced more recently. But I have noticed that identifying the very specific oppression of women, the very specific discrimination against women has somewhat been diluted, as if we have actually reached the equal playing field, and we actually haven't. We are actually far, far from it. And I think recent events in Australia with Grace Tame, with Brittany Higgins, and with others shows that very, very starkly. So Cedaw addresses women's legal status specifically and reproductive rights. They're the two main things that it really hammers into. Do you want to just go back a bit? It's thank you. So Cedaw provides a comprehensive framework for challenging the various forces that have created and sustained discrimination upon sex. It's a very powerful, very, very powerful piece of legislation. And I would suggest, from an advocacy point of view, it is not used enough. It's not used enough. Okay, we'll pop across to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so how do we use these two pieces of legislation? Well, international law takes precedence over domestic law. Whether the politicians like it or not, it just does. When a country signs up to and ratifies an international convention, they are obliged to implement it. So that means policies and legislation pertaining to women and girls in Australia that have been developed since effectively 1979 reflect both these conventions. Oh, it's gone back. So when advocating for human rights for women with disability, you can specifically point to the obligations required under these treaties. So I mentioned before is Article 6 in the CRPD, and you can use every piece of the Cedaw. As Freya said in the beginning, you can take this to ministers, government departments, service providers, and say, under international law that Australia has signed and ratified, we are obliged, and I'm using we as we the country, are obliged to enact these obligations. And it's a matter of reminding our lawmakers, our policymakers, and our authority figures that they have responsibilities to do this, and they are monitored. As I said earlier in the first picture, when I was in Geneva, that was a review and monitoring of Australia. And they came up very, very short. Human rights are women's rights. Women's rights are human rights. And I don't think there's any more that needs to be said than that. They are inalienable. And we, as women, should enjoy and exercise all forms of rights, protections, and privileges on an equal basis with men. Okay, I think that comes to the end of the slides. Yes, it does. So there's a lot there. And there is a lot more I could have gone into, but I figured we could have some time to talk about it and unpack it, and maybe talk about your experiences and maybe how you could use both or one of these pieces of international human rights law. So shall we open it up to people? You can ask me pretty much anything and we can talk about things together.
This is Nidhi Shikaran speaking to you. I have a question. My question is, okay, we have these laws, and okay, we have inclusion committees and stuff, but how do we then see it in action? In terms of what will we see in action for these, whether these laws are enacted properly or not? Because for me, as a vision impaired person, and also seeing it in action is sometimes difficult to actually see it working, whether it's working. How do we say whether it's working or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. Monitoring and evaluation is really important with all forms of legislation or policy, including international human rights law. Here in Australia, the primary mechanism for monitoring and checking the CRPD is the Australian Disability Strategy. And it's a framework that is in place to ensure that the CRPD is implemented across every branch of government. So the federal, states, territories, and local government.
So we check the outcomes of the disability strategy. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, yeah. And that's on the Disability Gateway. It's a little bit different with Cedaw, as there is the national strategy to prevention of violence against women and their children. And this is in its 4th stage. Is that correct, Freya? It's the 4th stage. So there is also a national strategy. However, I think there are many people within our own sector and the women's sector who would suggest that it has been diluted in recent times. There is also a committee that sits within the Prime Minister's office to monitor that strategy. There is only one woman with disability on that committee, and that's Carolyn Fromeder from WIDA, Women with Disabilities Australia. So there are formal mechanisms to monitor and to ensure that both the international conventions are enacted. But the difficulty that we will have, especially with matters of human rights, is what is the flavour of the government of the day. And this present federal government doesn't have a comfortable relationship with human rights. That's across the board. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you very much for that response.
That's okay.
And I was going to say they don't have, the current government doesn't have a very good approach to human rights and how it's enacted.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable for them, and so that leads to a range of difficulties when it comes to implementing obligations under international human rights law. It's just uncomfortable. So
thank you. Thank you very much for your answer to my question.
You're welcome. Does anybody else have any questions?
I'd love to know more about the transformative equality.
Okay.
That sounded very intriguing.
Yes, it really, really is. It's a magnificent concept, and it comes out of the CRPD, as I said, and it has actually been extrapolated further into a human rights framework of disability. So this piece of work was done by the former chair on the committee of the CRPD, and her name is Professor Theresia de Jenner, and she's a professor of law at Bochum University in Germany. And she developed the human rights framework of disability, which discusses transformative equality and what that means and how it can be translated into real world action. Is anybody familiar with the Disability Royal Commission? There is an archive or a library of papers, of research papers that you can access. And there is one which is very, very good, which discusses transformative equality. And it is written by the current chair of the committee of the CRPD, Professor Rosemary Kayes, and our former co-CEO at PWDA, and that's Therese Sands. So I'd strongly recommend you go onto that website, pull up that paper and have a really good read. It articulates very beautifully what it means to be a human in the 21st century, a human who has intersectional experiences, and a human who is trying to navigate systems that aren't built for intersectional experiences. Because what's the system built for? Can anyone say? What's our system built for? That's our political system, our legal system, our education system, our health system even. Who's it built for? Are there any men in the room? Yes, white men. Specifically, a man aged between 18 and 65, fully educated, always reasonable, always rational, able-bodied, and white. That's what our system is built on. We do come from a British, framework. And, the Westminster system of democracy is good, and I'm grateful for it. But the Westminster system and all the subsystems that come out of it is built for privileged white men. Now, we had a bit of a chat about this the other day in our own organisation, and it was really interesting because some white men in the organisation felt uncomfortable. And why did they feel uncomfortable? Because they're aging. And soon they're going to become old white men. And my challenge to that is, yes, you will. Indeed. And you're going to be held accountable. And it's uncomfortable because the system hasn't changed. So you can either say, this makes me uncomfortable, I don't want to hear about it. Or you can say, this makes me uncomfortable, how do we change it? So we need our allies as well. Does that sort of answer the question, or did you want to explore that a little more deeply?
Thank you for the direction to those two, well, the framework, Human Rights Framework of Disability, but also those archive papers for the Royal Commission. I'll have a good look and read through those. So thank you for that extra sort of knowledge or guidance to knowledge. Yeah,
and I think also what needs to be recognised is a human rights framework and transformative equality are both inherently feminist concepts. And changing a system to be transformative and to be equal is a feminist concept, and that's where Cedaw is important. Does anybody currently know Australia's representative to the United Nations Cedaw Committee? It is the former Senator Natasha Stott-Despoja, who is also the former chairperson of Our Watch. So she's someone who I think is pretty well versed in law and how law works, but also in the issues that women in Australia are facing, particularly in the pandemic. So, any other questions? Because we're racing through here.
I have a couple, but I'll just wait and see if other people have any questions.
Sure.
I was just going to ask about kind of recommended websites to get further information, because from my little Google searches, I can see there's lots of stuff from all around the world. So where do we go for the most pertinent stuff for us?
Okay, and sorry, you're coming from which sector? Because I can't.
Sorry, I'm from New South Wales Health.
New South Wales Health. I would strongly recommend for both disability and also women that you look at the UN. For women, that's UN Women, and for disability, that's UN Enabled. And they are specific parts of the UN, and they're very up to date. They're very on the pulse, particularly around the pandemic. In fact, UN Enabled and UN Women released a very, very good report on the impacts of the pandemic on women. And they did that, and I'm going to have a chat to Freya. They did that, was it the beginning of 2021 that one was released? I think it was, yeah.
Yeah.
Because we have actually since used that as a reference point for our own current research on the pandemic and the impacts on women with disability. So yeah, they're really working very hard. There's a specific committee, an advocacy committee out of UN Women around disability, and I'm actually on that committee. But their times are set for New York or London, so I don't actually sit the sitting hours because I can't 2 o'clock in the morning. So I would strongly recommend those 2 areas. I know that in government, you know, that the words best practice are very often used, and it's very fond of that. I think those 2 places are the best places to look for the most current, most important, and most pertinent information regarding women with disability in the 21st century pandemic.
Thanks, Frances. It's really helpful.
You're welcome. You don't happen to sit on the COVID roundtable advisory group, do you?
I don't, unfortunately, but I work in sexual assault services, and we're really having a big focus this year on making sure that we are not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, and that we're really supporting people living with disabilities as best we can. So systemic change speaks absolutely to my heart, but you're right, in a government organisation, I need to go in prepared with specific references that are going to be respected.
Yes, and I think policy 101 this is how I understood it and sort of learnt it, was that if you're going to make recommendations to government, do the work for them and just lay it out. Is that cruel? Is that cruel?
Apparently everyone's too busy to do the other work. So yes, it's about making it easy.
That's right. And, you know, I could run to say, well, that doesn't actually cover our funding and we do things for free, but that's a whole other issue. Accurate, not cruel. Thank you. So certainly when we try and release information, we make it really, really digestible. Certainly I would also point to our own website and Freya's work on building access in particular, and also the work that she and I are developing through the pandemic project. We're going to have some really good recommendations come June this year, I hope. Does anyone else have any other questions, or you'd like to discuss ideas? I've thrown an awful lot at you in a very short period of time, and I'm aware that it's complex thinking through.
I would like to suggest that that we think about how much funding we give into the community legal centres and services within the court system for people with disability, people who experienced abuse. Yep. Because that funding needs to continue, because
absolutely
it basically gives not the power, but it gives like a safety net for people who have experienced abuse and domestic violence.
Oh yes, I think that's absolutely an excellent point. I think that is
and
something.
Also, can I say that with the pandemic, I mean, there is a lot of support worker shortages within the NDIS, and NDIS is trying to bunch all the services together into the packages that people with disability have under their NDIS now, and it shouldn't be like that, because a lot of people are getting exited out because there's not enough funding to balance everything.
Yeah, that's something we're fighting for actually today. We have representatives in Canberra as there's an NDIS bill that is going through the House of Representatives, and we are being very, very vocal about our opposition to what's been happening with our NDIS, because it is our NDIS. So yes, we're working on that very actively. In terms of community legal centres, we absolutely support more funding to community legal centres. I'm very aware that in New South Wales in the recent past, community legal centres and women's centres more widely have experienced funding shortfalls or funding cuts. And these things have come home to roost most definitely, but that's a state and a federal issue as well. So we certainly support that. For anyone who's interested, we did some work in Queensland about 5 years ago now around the impacts of family and domestic violence on people with disability. And we had some very strong recommendations around how court services could be better, around how court processes could be better, how police could be better. So you can also go to our website to have a look at that. It's published, or you can contact Freya or I and we can flick you a copy. But the recommendations in that are very strong, and we have since gone on to use those recommendations in other pieces of lobbying work, particularly around the national strategy for the prevention of violence against women and their children. Yeah. Anything else?
I've got a second question, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Only because you just kind of touched on it then. So I'm really interested, and we'll go and read the research that you've produced around domestic and family violence and access to courts and court processes for women with a disability.
Yeah.
But I guess the missing, because I think that will really help with our advocacy with police. I've worked with a few women in particular with intellectual disabilities, where police have really taken the option of pursuing a charge to court out of her hands and deemed her unfit or unable to give evidence. And so I think that document you talk about would be really helpful. But the other thing I was curious about is how the CRPD, how I would use that in a way to advocate, given that that's international and police and courts, or local courts, criminal courts, are state. And there can seem like a big divide for court systems and police for us to use an international law
Mhm.
to advocate with. So just a
Mm,
bit of,
mm.
I guess, guidance. Yeah.
And it's uncomfortable for them too. So I've had a few chats with, I don't know if you know Kate Eastman, who's the senior counsel for the Disability Royal Commission, and she has some few choice words to say about the legal fraternity more broadly, including judges, senior judges, who are just pretty happy to have, you know, the what's it called, the Magna Carta. Sorry, I had to drag that out of my brain because it's Latin and I kept thinking Carpe Diem. Well, we're doing Carpe Diem right now, which is seize the day. But Magna Carta, we have judges here in Australia who think that's just enough. They don't need any other form of international law. So we need transformative equality in a very serious way. I can thoroughly sympathise with you with having to deal with the court system and police, particularly working with women with disability, especially women with intellectual disability. I've done that. There's also a very interesting project that was called the Unfitness to Plead project, which was done out of the University of Melbourne and the University of Galway. So I'd also recommend that you look that up. One of our good friends in the disability sector is Dr. Piers Gooding, was involved with that particular project, and that sheds quite a lot of light on how using current guidelines and practices within the court and police systems, how they can be more adaptive. Very often it's about choice. An example of how things can be adaptive, I am here in Queensland. We do have dedicated DV courts, and when I was working on the project around DV and people with disability, I got to meet a senior magistrate from one of the DV courts who invited me down to the DV court to meet with all of the staff and to walk through the court, and using the access and audit tool that we've been using on building access. I used that tool and audited that space, and they changed it because there was a senior magistrate who was dedicated to the process and understood that a courtroom really is an especially sacred place to a judge or a magistrate. It's their space, they control it. And he knew that. And so he took the opportunity to make sure he could make structural changes before he moved on. Again, that's another barrier we face.
I've got a question, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sparrow and I work in domestic violence. And currently with the WDV CAS in Newcastle, which is the Women's and Domestic Court Advisory Service.
Okay.
And I'm a graphic designer by trade, so we're redeveloping some resources for people with intellectual disability to understand the ABO process and all of the above. I guess my question to you is, what do we do at a grassroots local level in order to make things more accessible?
Oh gosh. Accessible for your service or accessible for the courts?
Both, really. I mean, your senior magistrate tip's a great one. I can print out the audit form and take it in. But how do we in-bake accessibility into these environments?
I think that's got to do with communication and cooperation across systems. And I think that's an ongoing theme, isn't it, within the women's sector and particularly the DV sector. We've got siloed systems. And so having that relationship with your local courts, with your local magistrates and your local police officers, I think is really important. And so from a local level, you can get in there and make changes. And it's the same with your own service. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
It's okay. It doesn't always work though. Sorry. I think,
Trust me, we're trying.
Don't want to be too Polarani-ish, that was really great. What was the success that we had in the South? It was a Southport DV court, but I can tell you that other places just went, no, I don't have to do this.
And one major issue that we've identified is all the information on the internet is pretty much incomprehensible if you don't have a legal degree.
That's exactly right. That's something that we identified for the court system in Queensland, and when we identified that, they had a light bulb moment and immediately got Auslan videos up to explain the court process.
Excellent, that's amazing.
Yeah, I think they're still up. I haven't looked recently, but you might want to look at Queensland Courts, the website, and have a look at that.
I'll look into it, thank you.
You're welcome. PWDA takes credit for that work. We made that happen. So, and that was in the process of gathering evidence. It wasn't at the end of the report, it actually happened in the middle of it. So, also witness intermediaries, which was a suggestion or recommendation out of our final report in Queensland, and it took 4 years, but they're taking them up. Yeah, and sometimes it's hard graft, you know. I'm just aware of the time, Freya. You want some?
Yeah, I think if any, we could probably take one more burning question if anyone has one. Otherwise, I have a few comments and then we'll finish up. So any burning questions from anyone? Okay, well, thank you so much, Frances. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and making it engaging and accessible for us all. It's, yeah, I deeply appreciate it. And I think this webinar will also be a really useful resource. We're going to put it up on the Building Access webpage in the next few weeks. So if you'd like to revisit anything or share it, please do when it's up. But I just also had a few comments to a couple of the later questions. Firstly, the one in relation to the police issues. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything Frances said. And I think also, yeah, and taking an audit tool down to to the police as well, and, you know, checking whether they've actually followed process and that these women have had appropriate support. And on that, I would also like to mention the Justice Advocacy Service in New South Wales, which is a really fantastic service. It's run out of the Intellectual Disability Rights Service, and they basically offer support to people with, I think it's broadened now to anyone with a cognitive impairment who's having any kind of interaction with the justice system, you know, starting with police, obviously, and they do advocate for people in legal situations. So, and I think they might be a really useful service to link up with. So yeah, that again is the Justice Advocacy Service. And to the other question as well about how do we keep making, you know, these sectors and systems more accessible, I would just, you know, another shout out to Frances and the webinar, and just say that, you know, I think if we all become really familiar with the human rights conventions that we've talked about, and that we keep raising those when we see that services or systems are not upholding women's rights, I think that's a powerful action. It's absolutely, you know, sometimes exhausting, especially when, you know, we're sort of, you know, we're under-resourced. But I think that is something that we can all keep doing as supporters of women with disability who have experienced abuse. So, but there is also the Building Access webpage where we have that audit tool we've been talking about, and we have lots of other sort of pretty, I hope they're digestible resources that really highlight, you know, quick ways you can make your service more accessible, and just the basic fundamentals of access and true inclusion. So I would absolutely recommend checking them out. And perhaps also when we post this on that webpage, we can gather up the links we've mentioned and put them on the page below as well. But it's basically, yeah, we can perhaps, yeah, put those links below when we post this on the Building Access page. You can just search PWDA Building Access and that page will come up. So yeah, I'd just like to thank you all for being here as well, and for taking the time out of your day to learn about this. And it's really heartening to have had so much engagement and so much interest. And yeah, let's all keep just fighting this good fight and making the world more inclusive and just. So yeah, thank you to everyone. And lastly, we have another webinar next week. It's on, again, it's about women with disability who have experienced abuse, but it's talking about NDIS appeals and advocacy. So we know that women with disability experience a lot of abuse from perpetrators as well, and that you know, we need the NDIS, particularly in times of crisis, particularly, you know, when we're looking at starting a new life. And we are going to hear from Frances again about how we can advocate for women who need to use the NDIS and who are having difficulty, which is a huge number of women. So yeah, thank you everyone, and hope to see some of you next week.